The notice arrived on the 3rd of November, 1911, slipped beneath the cottage door sometime before dawn, as though the person who delivered it had no interest in being present when it was read. We want you to sit with that detail for a moment. Not the words on the paper, we'll get to those, but the act of sliding it under a door in the dark. There is a particular kind of cowardice in that, the kind that wears the costume of business and calls itself practical. The young woman who found it was named Nettie Sparrow, and she was 22 years old. She had been living in the cottage on the Royce property, a low, cedar-sided house at the edge of the spruce woods above Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia, for 5 years. She had come there at 17, already alone in the world, after her mother died of fever and left nothing behind but a shawl and a name. A neighbor had pointed her toward old Hilda Royce, who took in girls sometimes when they had nowhere else to be. Hilda had not been a charity woman. She had been a teacher, and what she taught, she expected to be learned properly. By the time Nettie crouched on the cold stone floor that November morning and read the notice through twice, Hilda Royce had been dead for 41 days. The letter was from the office of Mr. Franklin Quaid, proprietor of Quaid & Sons Merchants, situated in Bridgewater. It explained, in the flat language of men who deal in ledgers, that Hilda Royce had carried an outstanding account of $47.60 with Quaid & Sons at the time of her death, as there were no living relatives to assume the debt, and as Mr. Quaid held a creditor's lien on the property contents. The personal effects of the late H. Royce were hereby claimed in partial satisfaction of said debt. Furthermore, as the property itself would be settled by the county, the current occupant, listed in the letter as one N. Sparrow, lodger, was to vacate the premises within 12 days. 12 days. Nettie read the letter a third time. Then she folded it into quarters and set it on the kitchen table, next to the cooling mug of tea she had not yet touched. She was not Hilda's daughter. She had no legal claim to anything in that cottage. This she understood. What she also understood, sitting in the thin blue light of a November morning with the spruce trees pressing close against the windows, was that she had $3.80 to her name, no family, no references, and a craft that most people in Mahone Bay considered an eccentricity at best. What she had beside the money and the craft was a small leather notebook filled with Hilda's handwriting, and a carved birch soap mold about 6 inches long, worn smooth from years of use, with a pattern of yarrow flowers pressed into one face. Hilda had made the mold herself, back when her hands were still steady enough for carving. She had pressed it into Nettie's hands 3 weeks before she died, not as a gift exactly, but as the passing of a thing that needed to keep going. The recipe book and the mold, Hilda had said. The rest is just furniture. We think about that sometimes. What we leave behind and what we think is worth the leaving. Nettie spent the first 2 days doing what Hilda had always told her to do before making any significant decision. She made soap. Not because she had a market for it right then, not because it was sensible, but because the rhythms of the work, measuring the lye, rendering the fat, timing the trace, required the kind of attention that kept fear from becoming panic. She worked through the cottage stores methodically. She boiled sweet fern leaves, gathered from the ridge above the bay. She melted tallow she had rendered herself from a piece of suet the butcher's wife had given her. She added the spruce gum she had tapped from the trees at the property's edge all through September, just as Hilda had showed her, heating it gently until it dissolved into a golden amber resin that smelled like the forest floor after rain. And she read the notebook. She had read it before, of course. She had helped Hilda write parts of it. But in those 5 years, she had read it as a student reads a teacher's notes, absorbing what she was told to absorb, trusting the rest would make sense in time. Now she read it as though she were reading a letter addressed directly to her, which, she began to understand, was exactly what it was. Hilda had been making soap in that cottage for 31 years. The notebook was not simply a recipe book. It was an argument, a careful, methodical, slightly obsessive argument built over 3 decades of observation about why certain combinations of local plants, used in precise proportions and at precise stages of saponification, produced a soap that behaved differently from any other she had encountered. The wounds on fishermen's hands that wouldn't close. The persistent rashes on the children in the valley. Hilda had documented case after case in her cramped, deliberate hand. Names, dates, conditions, results. She had written down what she gave, when she gave it, and what happened after. It was not the notebook of a hobbyist. It was something closer to a medical record. Nettie sat at the kitchen table until the lamp ran low, reading in the last of the kerosene light, and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope exactly. Something quieter and more durable than hope. The recognition that there was more here than she had understood before. On the fourth day, she went into town. She hitched a ride on a fish cart as far as the crossroads, then walked the last mile into Mahone Bay with the mold in her coat pocket and a wrapped parcel of soap under her arm. She called on every woman she knew, which was not many, and offered her product plainly. 4 cakes for 30 cents. She did not undersell. She did not beg. She held the parcel as Hilda had always held hers, like something with a fair price attached, no more and no less. By afternoon, she had sold 12 cakes and had enough to pay for 3 nights in the boarding house on Edgewater Street, run by a woman named Eunice Pye, whose husband Garnet ran the smithy next door. Eunice Pye was a short, deliberate woman in her 50s who asked no more questions than were necessary, and whose greatest virtue, in Nettie's experience, was that she treated a woman's trouble as simply a logistical problem to be solved, rather than a source of entertainment. "You'll need a place to work," Eunice Pye said, when Nettie explained her situation over a bowl of salt fish and potatoes that evening. "I was thinking the commons land above the mill," Nettie said. "There's a flat area with good drainage. Cold in winter. I've worked cold before." Eunice looked at her for a long moment. "Garnet's got a lean-to behind the smithy. He doesn't use it from November through March. The heat carries through the south wall from the forge. You could work there, if you keep it tidy and don't bring trouble." Nettie asked what she meant by trouble. "I mean Mr. Quaid," Eunice said. "He has opinions about where commerce happens in this town, and he has made it inconvenient for people who don't share them. We should tell you something about Mr. Franklin Quaid. He was a man who had arrived in Lunenburg County 20 years earlier, with a small inheritance and a talent for understanding what other people needed before they knew they needed it themselves. He had built Quaid and Sons into the largest dry goods operation between Halifax and Yarmouth. And he had done it by being generous when generosity was an investment, and ruthless when ruthlessness cost him nothing. The debt he had held over Hilda Royce's estate was real. Hilda had needed supplies on credit in her later years, when her hands had stopped cooperating with the work. But the sum could have been forgiven. It was $47. Mr. Quaid's monthly tobacco bill was larger. He had not forgiven it, because he had wanted the cottage cleared. He had wanted to expand his storage operation to the eastern side of the bay, and the Royce property sat at the most convenient point on that road. Clearing out a 22-year-old girl with no resources and no connections had seemed, from the vantage of his office, a simple matter. He had not, it should be said, thought about her very much at all. Nettie set up her operation in the lean-to behind Pye's smithy on the 12th of November, the last day allowed to her by Mr. Quaid's letter, as it happened. She had salvaged what she could from the cottage before the county man arrived to inventory the contents. The notebook, the mold, 2 copper pots, a set of molds Hilda had fashioned from tin, a bundle of dried sweet fern, and a small crock of spruce gum that was worth more to her than everything else combined. She spent the first week restocking her materials. She gathered yarrow from the south-facing slopes above the bay, where it grew in long pale patches, bleached by the autumn. She traded 4 cakes of soap to a farmer's wife for a quantity of tallow. She found a second source of spruce gum in the stand of trees behind the churchyard. Older trees, with a harder, more resinous sap than the ones at the cottage. And she noted in the margin of Hilda's notebook that the churchyard spruce made a soap that held its scent longer. She added the date and the compass bearing from the road. She was doing what Hilda had done, building a record. By the end of November, she was selling steadily to a small but reliable group of customers, the fishing families along the harbor front, 2 of the women from the church auxiliary, the barber on Main Street, who had discovered that one particular formula reduced the razor rash his customers complained about. She was not comfortable, she was not secure, but she was working, which was, for Nettie Sparrow, the necessary condition for everything else. We'd like to pause here for a moment, because this is the part of the story that doesn't make the headlines. The weeks of cold mornings and sore hands, and the smell of lye that never quite washed out of your hair, the careful arithmetic of whether you could afford a second pound of tallow this week or whether it needed to wait. The particular loneliness of building something when no one is watching and no one is certain you'll succeed. If you've ever been in that position, and we suspect some of you have, you know that the hardest thing isn't the cold or the money. It's the discipline of continuing to believe the work matters when there's no evidence yet that it does. Nettie continued. It was in the second week of January that Dr. Bernard Oakes came to Mahone Bay. He was a physician from Halifax, a quiet and methodical man in his mid-40s who had spent the better part of 15 years studying infection and wound management, and who had developed over that time an unusual practice of investigating folk remedies that seemed to produce results that conventional medicine could not easily explain. He was in Mahone Bay to call on the family of a fisherman who had survived a serious wound infection the previous autumn. A case his colleague in Bridgewater had mentioned in passing, noting that the infection had responded to nothing from the standard dispensary but had cleared entirely after the man's wife began applying a local soap to the wound twice daily. The wife told Dr. Oakes without hesitation where she had bought it. At the smithy, she said, from the young woman with the red cart. He found Nettie on a Tuesday afternoon, stirring a batch at the long work table she had built from salvaged boards, her hair pinned back and her coat splattered with tallow. She looked up when he knocked on the lean-to door and gave him the particular expression she had learned to give strangers who arrived without explanation. Neutral, unhurried, waiting. Dr. Oakes introduced himself and explained his purpose with a directness she appreciated. He asked if she could show him her materials and, if she was willing, share something of her method. Nettie considered him for a moment. Then she said, I'll show you what I use. The method is written down. It was written by the woman who taught me. She showed him the notebook. We want to be precise about what happened next because it matters. Dr. Bernard Oakes was not a man given to enthusiasm. He had spent too many years in clinical practice to be easily impressed, but he spent 40 minutes at that work table, reading Hilda Royce's notebook, and by the end of those 40 minutes, his expression had changed in a way that Nettie, who had spent 5 years learning to read faces, could not misinterpret. This woman was a physician, he said, which was not quite what he meant, but was the closest word he had. She was a soap maker, Nettie said. She was documenting the antimicrobial properties of sweetfern and spruce resin 30 years before anyone in Halifax thought to look at them seriously. He turned back a page, then forward again. This entry here, 1903, the fisherman's hand. The description matches a streptococcal infection. The resolution time is remarkable. There are 6 similar cases in here. He looked up. Who else has seen this? No one, Nettie said. It was hers. It's yours now? She touched the notebook's worn cover. She left it to me. Dr. Oakes sat back. He looked at the copper pots, the drying bundles of sweetfern, the carved birch mold sitting on the shelf, with its yarrow pattern worn to a soft impression from 30 years of use. He looked at the orderly arrangement of tins and crocks, each one labeled in Hilda's handwriting with the date of harvest and the location. I'd like to bring a colleague from Halifax to speak with you, he said. A medical colleague. Would you be willing to meet with him? That depends, Nettie said, on what he wants. To understand the formula, and to discuss whether it might be produced in greater quantities. She asked him what that would mean in practice. He told her honestly that he wasn't certain yet, but that he believed Hilda Royce had documented something of genuine medical significance, and that the woman who carried her notebook and her mold and her 5 years of apprenticeship was, as far as he could determine, the only person who understood how to make it correctly. Nettie said she would think about it overnight. She did not want to seem eager, not because she wasn't, but because Hilda had always said that the first offer in any transaction was not the actual offer. The meeting with Dr. Oakes's colleague took place the following Thursday. His name was Dr. Cyrus Mallard, and he held a laboratory affiliation with the Nova Scotia Medical College, and he was, unlike his quieter colleague, very clearly a man accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. He greeted Nettie with the particular brand of courtesy that implies the recipient should be grateful for it. She showed him the notebook. He asked questions. She answered them carefully, because Hilda had also taught her that you could tell a great deal about a person's intentions by what they chose to ask about first. Dr. Cyrus Mallard asked first about the formula specifics, then about the sourcing of materials, and then, almost as an afterthought, about who currently owned the land where the sweetfern and spruce grew in the greatest concentration. Nettie said she wasn't certain of the legal boundaries, but that the best stands were above the eastern side of the bay. The land, as it happened, was part of the estate that included the Royce cottage, which Mr. Franklin Quaid had, by that point, taken control of in lieu of Hilda's debt, and was in the process of having cleared for his storage expansion. She did not mention any of this. In February, a letter from the Nova Scotia Medical College arrived at Eunice Pye's boarding house, addressed to Miss Nettie Sparrow. It outlined an offer. The college wished to commission the production of Hilda Royce's soap formula under documented and reproducible conditions, with a view toward clinical trials. They were prepared to offer Miss Sparrow a consulting arrangement, acknowledging her as the current custodian of the formula and the method, at a sum that made her read the page twice and then go sit down. The sum was $400, with the potential for additional compensation should the trials confirm the formula's efficacy. We will let you absorb that number. $400 in 1912 in Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia, was not a fortune of the kind that changed the shape of the world, but it was enough to change the shape of a life, which is the only kind of fortune that most of us ever encounter. There was a condition. The formula required sweet fern from a specific location. Hilda had noted it precisely in the notebook, including the soil type, the drainage, and the compass bearing from the bay. That location was on land that now belonged to Mr. Franklin Quaid. It was Dr. Oakes who brought this information to Quaid's attention. We think he took some professional satisfaction in the delivery. Mr. Franklin Quaid received the news in his office on a Thursday afternoon in the middle of February, and he sat with it for a considerable time. The account that reached him over the following week was this. The young woman he had evicted from the Royce cottage in November, the one with no resources and no prospects, was now under commission from the provincial medical establishment. The plants growing on the land he had just acquired were not weeds. They were, according to the college's preliminary assessment, the source of a documented natural antiseptic with applications that could extend well beyond homemade soap, and the formula, the decades of observation and precise calibration that made those plants medically reliable, existed in a notebook that belonged to Nettie Sparrow. Not to him, to her. He requested a meeting. Nettie agreed to one, at a time and location of her choosing, the front room of Pye's boarding house, with Eunice Pye in the adjoining room and the door left an inch open. She arrived with the notebook and the birch mold and the medical college letter, and she sat across the table from Mr. Franklin Quaid and looked at him with the particular steadiness of a person who has spent a winter building something from nothing and has no intention of being moved. He opened by calling it an unfortunate misunderstanding. She let him finish. He offered to allow access to the sweetfern stands at a reasonable leasing rate. She said nothing. He suggested a revenue-sharing arrangement. She waited. She said, "Mr. Quaid, the notebook that contains the formula is mine. The relationship with the medical college is mine. The knowledge of how to harvest these plants correctly so that they remain productive season after season is mine. You have the land. I have everything required to make the land useful." She folded her hands on the table. "My proposal is this. You sell me the cottage and the eastern field at the assessed county value, which I believe is approximately $60. I will pay you from my first commission. In return, I will maintain the sweet fern and the spruce, which is also in my interest, and we need never have another meeting." Mr. Quaid looked at her for a long moment. She waited. He said, "Finally, you've thought about this carefully." "I've had a quiet winter," she said. The deed to the cottage and the eastern field was transferred to Nettie Sparrow in the first week of March. Mr. Quaid signed it in the county office without ceremony. She did not celebrate outwardly, or if she did, it was privately, in the way of a person who has been through enough that triumph and relief feel like the same quiet thing. She moved back into the cottage the following week. She replaced the furniture that had been taken, a table, 2 chairs, a sleeping cot, with things she had chosen herself, which made the space feel different than it had before. Not better or worse. Hers. She hung Hilda Royce's birch mold on the wall beside the kitchen window, at the height where the morning light struck it and showed the yarrow pattern most clearly. The medical college trials continued through the spring and into the summer. The results, when they came, confirmed what Hilda had spent 30 years documenting in a notebook that no one had thought to ask to see. The formula was effective. It was reproducible. It worked because of the specific combination of plant materials Hilda had identified, harvested with the precise timing she had recorded, and prepared by a method she had refined over decades and passed on to the one person who had been willing to learn it properly. Nettie did not stop making soap by hand. She continued to sell it in Mahone Bay at the same fair price, to the same fishing families, and the barber and the women from the auxiliary. She hired a girl to help her in the summers, a quiet 15-year-old from the valley, who had good hands and a willingness to pay attention, and she taught her the way Hilda had taught her. Slowly, precisely, without skipping the parts that were difficult. The notebook she never lent out. She had it copied by a careful hand in Halifax, and sent one copy to the medical college and kept the original herself. It sat on the shelf beside the copper pots and the crock of spruce gum in the cottage above Mahone Bay, on the land that was hers. She tended the sweet fern stands every August, as Hilda had taught her, cutting only what would grow back by the following year. She tapped the spruce trees in September and let them rest for 2 seasons before returning. She added her own observations to the back pages of the notebook, in handwriting that was nothing like Hilda's, but was legible and precise and dated. She had not been given a fortune. She had not been rescued by anyone. What she had been given by a woman who had seen something in a 17-year-old with nowhere else to go was attention, the knowledge of how to pay it, how to sustain it, and how to pass it along. That, we think, is the only inheritance that cannot be seized by a creditor's lien or slipped under a door in the dark. We'll leave you with a question, and we mean it genuinely. If someone handed you a notebook full of everything they had spent their life learning, would you know what you were holding? And what would you do with it?